Somewhere in the ancient city of Jerusalem, beneath a sky thick with stars and the smell of cedar smoke and burning incense, a woman is running. She's not running away from the city. She's running deeper into it, through narrow stone corridors, past sleeping guards and darkened doorways, clutching something against her chest with both arms. Something small, something warm, something that must not make a single sound. Behind her in the royal palace, the screaming has already begun. Soldiers are moving through the halls of the palace of Judah, and they are not searching for enemies of the crown. They are searching for children, royal children, every last one of them. Because the woman who has seized the throne of David has decided that the only way to guarantee her survival is to make absolutely certain that no one else can claim what she has taken. And in this single terrifying night, the entire 400-year legacy of David's royal bloodline, the covenant that God himself had spoken over a shepherd boy with a sling, has been reduced to one crying infant and one woman willing to risk everything to keep that infant alive. What you're about to hear is not a myth. It is not a legend dressed up in dramatic language to make it feel more exciting than it is. It is one of the most carefully documented political rescues in the ancient world. The story of a kingdom brought to the edge of extinction, of an infant hidden inside the very house of God, and of a restoration so carefully planned, so quietly prepared that when it finally arrived, it arrived like thunder. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to be carried back nearly 3,000 years to a city on a hill, to a people at the edge of collapse, and to a child sleeping in secret, the last heir of an ancient promise. To understand what happened on the night Joash was hidden, you first need to understand the world into which he was born and the specific chain of failures, alliances, and betrayals that made his mother's massacre not only possible, but to many observers at the time almost inevitable. The kingdom of Judah in the 9th century before the Common Era was not a peaceful place. It had not been peaceful for a very long time. When the great unified kingdom of Israel under Solomon finally fractured, splitting into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, the two nations spent the better part of 2 centuries in a complicated and often violent relationship. They shared a history, a language, and a God. But they did not share a king, and they did not always share values. The northern kingdom of Israel in this period was dominated by the dynasty of Omri, a powerful military commander who had seized the throne through force and whose descendants would prove to be among the most religiously compromised rulers in the biblical record. Omri's son was a man named Ahab, and Ahab famously married a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. Most people who have even a passing familiarity with the biblical narrative know the name Jezebel. She has become across 3,000 years of literature, theology, and cultural commentary, the archetype of the dangerous, manipulative, religiously deviant woman. Whether that characterization is entirely fair is a matter for careful historical analysis. What is not disputed, at least within the framework of the text, is that Jezebel brought with her to the northern court an aggressive promotion of Baal worship, a systematic persecution of the prophets of the God of Israel, and a political philosophy that placed royal power above moral accountability. It was into this world that the connection between the two kingdoms was forged. At some point in the mid-9th century, the king of Judah, a man named Jehoshaphat, who is generally regarded positively by the biblical chroniclers, made a political alliance with the house of Omri. His son Jehoram married Athaliah. Athaliah was almost certainly the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, which made her both a princess of the northern kingdom and a carrier of the religious and political values that had taken root in her parents' court. The alliance seemed pragmatic at the time. The two kingdoms had common enemies. A marriage between their royal houses would stabilize the border and create a unified front against external threats. These are the kinds of calculations that rulers have made throughout human history, and they often seem wise until the long-term consequences reveal themselves. The long-term consequences in this case were catastrophic. Jehoram of Judah, Jehoshaphat's son, began to walk in what the biblical text calls the ways of the kings of Israel. The language is pointed. He was not following the religious traditions of his own kingdom. The kingdom that housed the temple in Jerusalem, the kingdom that maintained the priesthood descended from Aaron. He was following the practices he had absorbed through his wife and her family. The text records that Jehoram built high places, local worship sites dedicated to foreign deities in the mountains of Judah. He led the people of Judah astray. He executed his own brothers to consolidate his power, and the kingdom suffered visibly under his reign in ways that the chroniclers attributed directly to this departure from the covenant. Jehoram died unmourned according to the text and was succeeded by his son Ahaziah. Ahaziah's mother was a failure, and here is where the story begins to accelerate toward catastrophe. Uzziah was 22 years old when he became king of Judah. His mother was his political advisor. His closest allies were in the northern kingdom, the family of his grandmother Jezebel, the family of Ahab. He made decisions that aligned Judah not with its own traditions and covenant, but with the interests of the increasingly unstable northern court. And then in the span of a single dramatic year, everything collapsed. In the northern kingdom, a military commander named Jehu received a prophetic commission to execute judgment on the house of Ahab. This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a carefully documented act of prophetic appointment. The prophet Elisha sent a messenger to anoint Jehu and charge him specifically with ending the dynasty of Omri. Jehu was a man of decisive and, it must be said, sometimes brutal action. He moved quickly. He killed King Joram of Israel, the son of Ahab and Jezebel, and the reigning king of the northern kingdom at the vineyard of Naboth, in a location that carried its own prophetic significance. He killed Jezebel herself in Jezreel in a manner so specific and so complete that it fulfilled a prophecy spoken years earlier. And in the course of his campaign, he encountered Ahaziah, king of Judah. Ahaziah had come north to visit his wounded cousin Joram. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, allied with the wrong family. Jehu killed him too. Ahaziah had reigned for 1 year. He left behind a mother, several sons, and a kingdom, and thrown into sudden and complete political chaos. His mother was a failure. Now we arrive at the moment that defines everything that follows. When the news of Uzziah's death reached Jerusalem, Athaliah faced a choice. She could have mourned her son and supported the transition of power to one of his legitimate heirs. She could have assumed a regent's role while a young heir grew into kingship. These were normal, expected responses for a queen mother in the ancient Near East. She chose neither. What Atha did next is described in the biblical text with remarkable brevity, which somehow makes it more chilling than any elaborate description could. She arose and destroyed all the royal seed of the house of Judah. She ordered the killing of every surviving member of the royal family, her own grandchildren, the sons of Uzziah, the legitimate heirs of David's covenant line. The motivations of historical figures are always difficult to reconstruct with certainty, and Athaliah is no exception. Some commentators have argued that she was acting out of political self-preservation, that she understood her position in Judah was precarious, that her son's death exposed her vulnerability, and that the only way to secure her own power was to eliminate every other candidate for the throne. Others have suggested a more ideological dimension, that she genuinely believed in the political philosophy she had inherited from her parents, a philosophy in which royal power was absolute and resistance was treason. What all interpreters agree on is that the act was unprecedented in Judah. The southern kingdom had maintained an unbroken Davidic succession for more than a century, the covenant that the text records God making with David. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever, had never been seriously threatened from within the royal family itself. Until this night, the soldiers moved through the palace. The heirs of David were killed one by one, and the 400-year promise that had been spoken over a shepherd boy in Bethlehem appeared to every human eye in Jerusalem that night to have been finally, permanently, catastrophically extinguished. Appeared to be, but was not. Her name was Jehosheba. In the economy of the biblical text, she receives only a handful of sentences. She is identified as the sister of King Ahaziah and the wife of the high priest Jehoiada. The chronicler adds that she was the daughter of King Jehoram, which means she was likely a half-sister to Ahaziah, born of a different mother. Whether that distinction protected her from Athaliah's purge is unclear. What is clear is that she was inside the palace when the killing began, and that she did something that required extraordinary courage and extraordinary presence of mind. She took the infant Joash. The text in 2 Chronicles 22 says, "She hid him from among the king's sons who were being put to death." This is a phrase that deserves to be read slowly. It implies that the killing was happening around her, that she did not have the luxury of time, of deliberate planning, of careful preparation. She acted in the midst of chaos. She reached into the carnage of the purge and pulled out one small child and his nurse, and she hid them. Where she hid them, at least initially, was in a bedchamber, a storage room somewhere inside the palace complex where the soldiers had already searched, or somewhere they would not think to look. The text does not give us the specific geography of those first terrifying hours. What it gives us is the outcome. The infant was not found. And then, when the immediate danger had passed enough to allow movement, she took him somewhere else, somewhere that Athaliah would not think to look, somewhere that even the queen's soldiers might hesitate to enter with swords drawn. She took him to the temple. The temple in Jerusalem in this period was not simply a building. It was the architectural and theological center of the entire Judean identity. Solomon had built it on the threshing floor of Arona, the Jebusite on the hill north of the old city of David, and its construction had consumed 7 years and resources gathered from across the ancient Near East. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from Aya, a bronze in quantity so vast the text says it was beyond weighing. But the temple was more than its materials. It was the dwelling place in the theological framework of the text of the God of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant rested in its innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies, behind a curtain of blue and purple and crimson that separated the accessible world from what the text called the divine presence. The priests and Levites who served in the temple operated on a carefully regulated schedule, maintaining the daily sacrifices, the incense offerings, the lamp that was never allowed to go out. The temple had its own gatekeepers, its own security protocols, its own hierarchical structure of access and service. And it had in this particular moment of national crisis one man at its head who would prove to be perhaps the most consequential figure in the entire story, the high priest Jehoiada. Jehoiada was Jehosha's husband. How long they had been married, how old he was when this crisis unfolded, what his relationship to the royal family had been in the years before. These are details the text does not provide in full. What the text does establish is that Jehoiada was a man of remarkable patience, extraordinary strategic intelligence, an unshakable theological conviction. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who acted without thinking. And when his wife arrived at the temple carrying an infant, who was, as far as the outside world knew, already dead, Jehoiada made a decision. He would hide the child. He would protect the child. He would raise the child and he would wait. How long would he wait? As long as necessary, years if required, until the moment was right, until the alliances were in place, until the risk of premature action had been replaced by the certainty of coordinated, irreversible change. 6 years as it turned out. 6 years of extraordinary disciplined silence. The logistics of hiding a living child inside a functioning temple complex for 6 years are worth pausing to consider because they reveal something important about both the physical layout of the temple and the extraordinary level of trust and coordination that Jehoiada was able to maintain. The temple complex in Jerusalem was not simply a single building. It was a compound, a series of courts, chambers, storerooms, and residences that housed a large number of priests and Levites who rotated through their service schedules on a regular basis. Priests lived on the premises during their periods of service. There were chambers for the storage of temple vessels and provisions. There were quarters for the gatekeepers. There were spaces that the ordinary population of Jerusalem never entered and would not have reason to investigate. Within this complex, it was theoretically possible for a small child to grow up without ever being seen by anyone who did not already know he was there. Not easily, and not without the active cooperation of everyone within that inner circle, but possible. The text tells us that Joash was hidden in the house of God for 6 years. It does not give us a detailed account of those years, of what his education looked like, of what he understood about his own identity, of what the daily rhythm of his hidden life felt like. But we can draw some inferences from what we know about priestly education in ancient Judah, and from what Joash's later actions suggest about his formation. He almost certainly learned to read, or at least to receive oral instruction, from the priests around him. He would have heard the Torah read and discussed. He would have watched the daily sacrifices from whatever vantage point his hidden life allowed. He would have grown up surrounded by the rhythms of temple worship, the morning and evening offerings, the incense, the psalms, the careful and reverent handling of the sacred vessels. He would also have grown up knowing at some point who he was. Children understand more than adults often give them credit for, and the secrecy surrounding his existence would have communicated even without explicit instruction that his life was not ordinary, that he was being protected, that outside the walls of this place the world believed he was dead. What that knowledge does to a child, the weight of a hidden identity, the awareness that one's very existence is dangerous, is a question that the text does not address directly. But it is a question worth sitting with. Joash did not choose the circumstances of his rescue. He did not choose the secrecy of his upbringing. He was simply alive in a place that should not have been able to contain him, protected by people who had decided that the promise he represented was worth any risk required to keep it. While Joash slept in the temple, Athaliah ruled Judah. Her reign lasted 6 years, exactly as long as the child she believed to be dead had been hidden from her. The coincidence is precise enough to feel deliberate, as if the narrative itself is making a point about the relationship between her false kingship and the authentic one growing in secret just out of her reach. The biblical account of her reign is brief and largely negative. She's not described as an administrator or a builder. She's described as a religious disruptor. The chronicler records that her sons had broken up the house of God and had also bestowed all the dedicated things of the house of the Lord upon Balaam. This is a specific and serious charge. These sons referred to here are probably the sons of Ahaziah, who served as her agents before they were killed, or possibly allies in her court who helped implement her religious policy. The sacred vessels and dedicated offerings of the temple were being redirected toward the worship of Baal. Baal worship in this period was not a minor theological deviation. It was a complete alternative religious system with its own priesthood, its own rituals, its own economics of sacrifice and offering. The prophets of the period described it with language that ranged from contempt to horror. Elijah had confronted it head-on at Mount Carmel. Elisha had continued that confrontation through every year of his long ministry, and now it had arrived in Jerusalem itself, in the city that housed the temple that stood as the symbol of the covenant between God and David. The people of Judah watching this unfold had no reason to hope. The royal family was dead. The Davidic line was extinct. The high priest was keeping his head down, maintaining the temple sacrifices as best he could, while the queen redirected its resources toward her own religious program. The prophets were, if they were active at all, operating in whatever underground space was available to them. From the outside, this looked like the end of something, the end of the covenant, the end of the promise, the end of the story that had been building since Abraham had walked out of toward a land he had never seen. From the inside of the temple, it looked very different. Consider the contrast that the narrative establishes here, because it is one of the most theologically dense contrasts in the entire Hebrew Bible. On one side of the temple walls, a usurper queen, a dismantled priesthood, idol worship installed in the sacred precincts, a kingdom being systematically stripped of its covenantal identity. On the other side of those same walls, a child growing up in the daily presence of the God whose covenant she was dismantling, learning the law, watching the sacrifices, being shaped day by the very traditions she was trying to erase. The temple was simultaneously the target of Athea's religious program and the hiding place of its ultimate undoing. She was, in effect, destroying the house that was protecting her own destruction. There is an irony in this that the text seems to relish, though it presents it with characteristic understatement. This is one of the narrative's most recurring theological claims, that the instruments of preservation are often hidden in plain sight, that the most dangerous thing to an oppressive system is often not what it can see and attack, but what it cannot see at all. Athaliah controlled the palace. She controlled the army. She controlled the public religious apparatus of the nation. She did not control what was happening quietly, invisibly, patiently inside the room where a child was sleeping. There is something deeply human about this dynamic that resonates far beyond its specific historical context. Every generation has known versions of this story of hope maintained in secret, while public reality presents a very different picture of communities preserving identity and tradition in spaces the dominant culture does not bother to monitor. Of children raised in hidden circumstances who grow up to become the agents of change that no one with power ever anticipated. Joash was 6 or 7 years old when Jehoiada began to move, old enough to be presented, to be recognized, to stand upright in front of a crowd and receive a crown. Not old enough to have orchestrated anything himself. He was the promise, not yet the king. The restoration was not his doing. It was the doing of Jehoiada, of Jehosheba, of the priests and soldiers and Levites who had kept the secret and now prepared to reveal it. But he was the center of it all. He always had been. The preparations that Jehoiada made for the coronation of Joash were not made in a moment of impulse. They were not the result of sudden opportunity or fortunate circumstance. They were the product of years of patient observation, careful relationship building, and disciplined strategic thinking. Jehoiada was watching. He was watching the army, tracking which commanders were loyal to Athaliah out of genuine conviction, and which ones served her only because there was no viable alternative. He was watching the mood of the people, the ordinary citizens of Judah who had watched their religious traditions dismantled and replaced with foreign worship, who remembered the God of their fathers and who were not, many of them comfortable with what they had been given. Instead, he was watching the priesthood, the Levites and gatekeepers and other temple workers who rotated through their service schedules, who came and went from Jerusalem according to the ancient regulations of temple service, and who might be, if approached at the right moment in the right way, willing to take an extraordinary risk for an extraordinary cause. And he was waiting, waiting with the kind of patience that is almost indistinguishable from faith. Waiting because he understood that premature action would not merely fail, it would be catastrophic. An attempted coup that was discovered before it was ready would not just kill Jehoash. It would likely trigger a purge of everyone associated with the temple, destroying the very network that had kept the child alive. The text in 2 Chronicles 23 begins with a phrase that deserves close attention. In the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself. This is the language of decisive preparation following a long period of endurance. It implies that the years before were not years of inaction. They were years of accumulating the strength, the relationships, and the confidence necessary to act at last. What Jehoiada did in that 7th year was to make contact with the military. He reached out to 5 specific commanders. The text names them as captains of hundreds, military officers responsible for units of soldiers. These were not random selections. These were men he had identified over years of careful observation as men of integrity, men who would respond to an appeal to the covenant traditions of Judah, men who might be willing to risk their lives on the claim that the last heir of David was alive and ready to take his throne. He brought them to the temple and he showed them the child. Imagine what that moment felt like. These were military men, soldiers who had spent the last 6 years serving a queen, who had come to power through mass murder, who had watched the religious traditions of their people systematically dismantled, who had perhaps told themselves that there was nothing to be done, that the old order was gone, that this was simply the world they now lived in. And then a high priest leads them into a chamber inside the temple, and a 7-year-old boy looks up at them, and the priest says, "He is alive, the son of Ahaziah, the grandson of Joram, the descendant of David. He has been here all along." The text records no dramatic response to this revelation. It simply proceeds directly to the planning. Who will stand where? Which gates will be secured? How the Levitical rotation schedule will be used to concentrate loyal forces inside the temple courts while maintaining normal appearances outside. The pragmatism of the planning is itself a kind of testimony to the seriousness with which these men took what they had been shown. They took an oath. The text is careful to note this. It was not a casual agreement or a tentative alliance. It was a sworn commitment made inside the temple before God. These 5 commanders and the forces under their command were now bound by something that could not simply be canceled if circumstances became inconvenient. The oath was the architectural foundation of the conspiracy. Everything else rested on it. The operational plan that Jehoiada devised was elegant in its use of existing structures. He did not need to import forces or create new arrangements. The temple already operated on a rotational system in which some priestly and Levitical units were coming on duty while others were going off. Normally, those going off duty would leave the temple precinct. Jehuda's modification was simple. On the day of the coronation, none of them would leave. The outgoing shift would remain at their posts. The incoming shift would arrive as usual. The temple would suddenly and without obvious external signal contain roughly twice its normal complement of armed loyal defenders. The weapons for this force were drawn from the temple's own armory, specifically from King David's weapons, a collection of spears and shields that had been stored in the temple precincts, probably as votive offerings or historical artifacts. The symbolic weight of this detail is considerable. The soldiers who would install David's descendant on his throne would be armed with weapons that may have been used in David's own campaigns. The past was literally being pressed into the service of the present. Jehuda gave the commander specific assignments. Certain units would guard the palace itself, ensuring that no reinforcements could reach a failure. Others would secure the temple gates, the foundation gate, the Sur gate, the various entrances through which the queen or her loyalists might attempt to enter and disrupt the ceremony. The entire complex would be locked down. The child would be protected at every point, and the child would be brought forward only when everything was in place, not before, not until the moment of irreversibility had arrived. This is, among other things, a master class in operational security. Jehoiada had kept the secret for 6 years. He was not going to compromise it in the final hours through impatience or carelessness. Every piece had to be positioned before the board was revealed. The day itself arrived like any other day in Jerusalem. The city went about its business. The markets opened. The priests rotated through their temple duties. The guards at the various gates of the city and the temple complex performed their standard routines. Nothing from the outside appeared unusual. Inside the temple, the movement was precise and careful. The outgoing shifts did not leave. New arrivals took their positions. The armory was opened quietly, and weapons that had not been touched in years, perhaps decades, were distributed to hands that had been waiting with various degrees of patience for exactly this moment. Jada moved through all of it with the steady confidence of a man who had been planning this day for a very long time. He had thought through every contingency. He had positioned every resource. He had done, in the language of military strategy, everything that could be done. What remained was the irreversible act of beginning. He brought Joash forward. The text does not give us a detailed description of what the child looked like on this day. It does not tell us whether he was frightened or composed, whether he understood the full weight of what was happening, or simply followed where Jehoiada led him. He was 7 years old. He had spent his entire conscious life inside the temple. He had been raised on the stories of his ancestors, on the law of Moses, on the traditions of the priesthood that surrounded him. He walked out into the light of the temple courts, and for the first time in his 7 years of existence, he was visible, not hidden, not protected by darkness and silence, and the careful ignorance of those who did not know he was there. Visible. The coronation ceremony itself was modeled closely on the protocols established in the Torah for the installation of a king. Jehoiada placed the crown on Joash's head. He placed in Joash's hands what the text calls the testimony, a document identified by most interpreters as a copy of the law, the covenant document that defined the terms of kingship in Israel. The king was not above the law. He was subject to it, accountable to it, defined by it. This was the essential distinction between the Davidic ideal of kingship and the political philosophy that Athaliah had imported from the house of Omri. Then the trumpets sounded. The sound of those trumpets is one of the great acoustic moments in biblical narrative. Everything that had been silent for 6 years became suddenly, violently, irresistibly loud. The people who had been gathered in the temple courts, the priests, the Levites, the soldiers, whoever else had been admitted to witness this moment, began to shout. The text records their words with precision. Long live the king, long live the king. In Jerusalem, in the 7th year of Athaliah's reign, on an otherwise ordinary morning, the world changed. The child who had been sleeping in secret behind temple walls was now standing in the sunlight with a crown on his head and a copy of the law in his hands. and the people around him were making a noise that could not possibly be contained within the temple courts. It was the kind of noise that carries across a city, the kind of noise that reaches people who are not invited to hear it, the kind of noise that makes a queen in a palace look up from whatever she is doing and feel, for the first time, something unfamiliar: fear. There is a moment in every carefully prepared plan when it becomes irreversible, when the clock cannot be turned back, when the secret is not a secret anymore, and everything that happens next is simply the working out of a reality that has already been established. The trumpets were that moment. The text tells us that Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king. She heard it from a distance, from wherever she was in the palace complex, removed from the temple courts, insulated in the ordinary routines of her reign. And the sound was wrong. It was the wrong kind of noise for a normal morning in Jerusalem. It was a sound she had not expected, had not authorized, and did not understand. She came to the temple. What she found when she arrived: the child standing at the pillar of coronation, the crown on his head, the trumpeters around him. The leaders and the people rejoicing was so far outside anything she had anticipated that her response, recorded faithfully in the text, is almost pitiable in its disorientation. She tore her robes and she cried, "Treason! Treason!" The irony of this moment is so complete that it borders on darkly comic. Here was a woman who had seized the throne through the mass murder of her own grandchildren, who had ruled Judah for 6 years through force and political will, who had dismantled the religious traditions of the nation and redirected its sacred resources toward her own devotional preferences. And she was crying treason. The person standing at the pillar of coronation was the legitimate heir to the throne that she had stolen. The people rejoicing around him were the people whose king he was by right of birth, by covenant, by every principle of legitimate succession that the Judean tradition recognized. She was the usurper. She had always been the usurper. And now in this moment, she could see it in the faces around her, in the weapons, in the hands of the guards, in the certainty of the high priest watching her with the patient calm of a man who has been waiting 6 years for exactly this. She saw all of it, and she cried, "Treason!" Jehuda's response to her appearance was measured and precise. He did not allow the crowd to kill her in the temple. Whatever she had done, whatever she deserved, the temple was a holy place, and he would not allow it to be defiled with bloodshed. He ordered the military commanders to escort her out of the temple precinct. He was specific about one additional point. Anyone who followed her was to be executed with her. She was taken through the horse gate of the palace, the service entrance used for animals and equipment, and she was killed there. The text records no final words, no dramatic speech, no appeal or negotiation or bargain. She arrived at the temple crying treason, and she was dead before the morning was over. 6 years. That was all it had taken. 6 years of a child sleeping in secret. 6 years of a high priest waiting and watching and planning. 6 years of weapons stored in an armory, waiting for hands that would use them in the right cause. 6 years of trumpets that had not yet sounded. And then one morning, the trumpet sounded. A failure's death was not simply the end of a political reign. It was the end of a particular kind of claim. The claim that raw power exercised without accountability is sufficient foundation for legitimate rule. She had seized the throne through violence. She had maintained it through suppression, suppression of the Davidic line, suppression of the covenantal religious tradition, suppression of the priesthood's proper function. Her regime was a demonstration of what happens when power becomes its own justification. She did not claim to rule because she had the right. She claimed to rule because she could and because she had made it impossible, as she thought, for anyone else to do so. This is a pattern that recurs throughout human history with enough regularity to be considered almost a law. Regimes built on suppression eventually encounter the thing they could not suppress. Sometimes it is a movement, sometimes it is an idea, sometimes it is a person. In this case, it was a 7-year-old child who'd been hiding in a temple alive and growing and waiting to step into the light. The speed of her failure's fall from the moment the trumpet sounded to the moment she was dead is worth noting. The text does not record any military resistance on her behalf. There are no loyal soldiers fighting their way into the temple to defend her. There are no supporters who rally to her cause when they learn what is happening. She arrived at the temple alone or nearly so, and she died without a battle. This is what happens when a regime's foundation is fear rather than loyalty. When the thing that held it together was simply the absence of alternatives. The moment an alternative appeared, standing in the sunlight with a crown on its head, the foundation dissolved. And there was nothing underneath it. The people were not mourning her. They were the ones making the noise that had drawn her to the temple, the noise of rejoicing, the noise of her people recognizing suddenly that the future they had given up on had been alive all along. There is a moment that the text records almost in passing, but that deserves more attention than it usually receives. After Athaliah is removed from the temple, and before her execution, the text notes that Jehoiada positioned the officers of hundreds over the host and all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and break it down. His altars and his images brake they in pieces thoroughly, and slew Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Matan, we have his name. The priest of Baal, who had been installed in the place of the legitimate Levitical priesthood, he died at the altars he had served. The altars that were now being systematically demolished by the people who had just watched a 7-year-old receive the crown of David. The speed of this religious reversal is almost disorienting. One morning, Baal worship was the state religion of Judah, enforced by royal authority and maintained by an official priesthood. By mid-morning, the queen who had promoted it was dead, and the people were tearing down the altars they had been required to maintain. This tells us something important about the depth of popular support for Athaliah's religious program. It was shallow. It was maintained by power, not by conviction. The moment the power collapsed, the program collapsed with it. The people did not need to be persuaded to tear down the Baal altars. They moved to do it immediately without instruction, as if they had been waiting for the permission that a living Davidic heir now represented. What Jehoiada did next is one of the most important and least celebrated acts in the entire narrative of the monarchy period. He did not simply restore political order. He did not simply install a new king and issue new administrative directives. He led the nation in covenant renewal. The text in 2 Chronicles 23 records that Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and between all the people and between the king that they should be the Lord's people. This is a specific theological act with deep roots in the tradition that Jehoiada had spent his life serving. It echoed the covenant renewal ceremonies of Moses at Sinai, of Joshua at Shechem, of the various moments throughout Israel's history when the people had gathered to formally reaffirm their identity as the people of the God who had called Abraham out of and spoken to Moses from the burning bush. The covenant had 3 parties: God, the king, and the people. This triangular structure was not accidental. It defined the terms of the relationship that the monarchy was supposed to embody. The king was not God's replacement. He was God's representative, accountable to the covenant, subject to the law, responsible for the spiritual health of the community he led. The people were not subjects of the king in the absolute sense. They were members of a community defined by covenant with God, and the king's legitimacy derived from his faithfulness to that covenant. And this was the opposite of the political philosophy Athaliah had brought with her from the house of Omri. It was the reason she had to be removed, not just because she was politically illegitimate, though she was, but because her presence was an ongoing distortion of the fundamental relationship between Israel's God, Israel's king, and Israel's people. The covenant renewal reset that relationship. It made explicit and public what the coronation had implied. This was not simply a change of rulers. It was a return to the proper ordering of reality. The reality that had been hidden like the child himself behind the walls of the temple for 6 years. The destruction of the Baal temple and the reinstatement of the proper temple service were the concrete expressions of this covenant renewal. The text records that Jehoiada set the offices of the house of the Lord under the hand of the priest, the Levites, whom David had distributed in the house of the Lord, to offer the burnt offerings of the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and with singing, as it was ordained by David. Every element of this restoration has a specific reference. The distribution of Levitical duties according to David's ordinance links the restored worship directly to the pattern established by the founder of the dynasty, whose heir now sat on the throne. The offering of burnt offerings, as written in the law of Moses, links it to the foundational covenant document that Jehoash had been given at his coronation. The rejoicing and singing links it to the worship tradition of the Psalms, a tradition that the Baal worship had displaced but had not destroyed. The temple that had been Jewish's hiding place was now becoming, under his reign, the center of a national spiritual restoration. The building that had protected him was now serving the function it had been built to serve. The circle was completing itself. Jehoash was 7 years old when he became king of Judah. He would reign for 40 years, one of the longest reigns in the history of the southern kingdom. He would oversee a significant restoration of the temple itself, establishing the first systematic fundraising and repair program in the building's history. He would by most measures be remembered as a reforming king, a positive figure in the difficult history of Judah's monarchy. He would also later in his reign make decisions that the biblical chroniclers record with sadness and even condemnation. The story of Jehoash is not a simple story of a man who was saved as an infant and lived perfectly ever after. The trajectory of his later years, particularly his relationship with the sons of Jehoiada after the high priest's death, contains its own complicated chapters that belong to a different telling. But on this day in the temple courts, with the crown new on his head and the trumpet still echoing against the stone walls of Jerusalem, he was simply a child stepping out of the shadows and into his inheritance. The text records that all the people of the land rejoiced and the city was quiet. The city was quiet. After 6 years of Athaliah's reign, after the chaos of the royal massacre, after the disorientation of watching the covenantal traditions of the nation being systematically dismantled, the city was quiet. Not the silence of suppression, not the silence of fear, the silence that comes after great noise, after the noise of trumpets and shouting and the tearing down of altars. When the storm has passed and the air is still and everyone is catching their breath and beginning slowly to understand that something has permanently changed. The temple that had hidden Jehoash for 6 years now became, under his early reign, the focus of his most significant royal project. The text in 2 Kings 12 gives a detailed account of Joash's temple repair program. The establishment of a collection chest at the gate of the temple, the systematic gathering of silver from the people, the engagement of craftsmen to carry out the necessary repairs. The temple had been damaged during Athaliah's reign. The sons of that wicked woman had broken into its sacred precincts and taken its dedicated vessels for Baal worship. The building itself had deteriorated. The repair program was not simply architectural maintenance, it was a statement of values, a declaration of what Joash's reign was for, a way of saying to the people of Judah, the thing that protected me in my most vulnerable years, the thing that stood when everything else fell, deserves to be honored, maintained, and restored. There is something quietly moving about this. The child who was hidden behind temple walls grows up to dedicate the resources of his kingdom to maintaining those walls. The sanctuary becomes the subject of his royal attention. He owes it not just gratitude but stewardship. The story of Joash has survived 3,000 years not because it is the most dramatic story in the biblical record. It is not. But because it speaks to something that every generation has recognized as true in its own experience, the experience of hidden hope. There are moments in history or in personal history, in national history, in the history of communities and traditions and ideas, when everything that matters appears to have been extinguished, when the forces of suppression or violence or simple entropy have done their work thoroughly enough that the future seems genuinely foreclosed, when the question stops being, how do things improve, and starts being, is there anything left to improve? Joash's story answers that question not with an argument, but with a narrative. Sometimes there is something left, something hidden, something growing quietly in a space that the forces of destruction have not thought to check, something that does not announce itself until it is ready, something that waits with a patience that seems from the outside indistinguishable from absence. The 6 years of Joash's hidden life are in the theological framework of the text a demonstration of a particular kind of faithfulness. Not the dramatic trumpet-sounding faithfulness of victory, but the quiet, daily, unglamorous faithfulness of maintenance, of keeping the child fed, of keeping the secret, of rotating the guards according to schedule and maintaining the morning and evening sacrifices, and not allowing the external darkness to extinguish the internal light. Jehoiada is the great hero of this story in some ways, greater perhaps than the child himself. He did not do anything spectacular. He did not call down fire from heaven or part a sea or defeat an army with 300 men. He hid a baby, raised a child, built a network, and waited. He brought weapons out of storage and positioned soldiers at gates and swore oaths in the dark. He waited 6 years, and then when the moment was right, he acted. The spiritual reading of this narrative, which has been a constant across Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic engagements with the biblical text, tends to focus on the idea of divine preservation operating through apparently ordinary human actions. The text does not record a dramatic divine intervention in the story of Joash. There are no angels. There are no miraculous signs. There is no voice from heaven directing Jehosheba to the right room or Jehoiada to the right commanders. There is a woman running through a palace. There is a high priest making a decision. There is a child who does not know what he represents sleeping in a room in a temple while the world outside under its 6 years of darkness. The theological point, as the tradition has generally understood it, is that these ordinary actions are themselves the divine preservation. The covenant that God made with David, the promise that his descendants would always have someone to sit on the throne, was not maintained by supernatural intervention, but by the courage and patience and faithfulness of two human beings who decided to act as though the promise was still operative, even when every visible sign suggested it had been canceled. This is a demanding kind of faith. It is much easier to believe in a promise when you can see evidence of its fulfillment. It is much harder to act as though the promise is still true when what you can see is the Queen of Baal worship sitting on David's throne, and the royal family lying dead in the palace. Jehosheba and Jehoiada acted as though the promise was still true for 6 years. Day after day, through every rotation of the priestly calendar, through every morning sacrifice and every evening offering, through whatever doubts and fears and exhaustions must have accompanied 6 years of keeping a child alive in secret, they acted as though it was still true. And it was. It had always been. It simply needed the right moment to become visible. In the story of Joash and Athaliah takes place at a period in ancient Near Eastern history that is for its era unusually well documented. The 9th century before the Common Era is a period in which the broad outlines of Israelite and Judean history can be correlated with archaeological evidence and with records from neighboring kingdoms, particularly Assyria, whose annals provide an important external check on the internal biblical chronology. The dynasty of Omri, the family from which Athaliah came, appears in the Assyrian records. The Teldon stele discovered in northern Israel in 1993 and 94 contains a reference to the House of David in an inscription that most scholars date to the 9th century, providing external epigraphic evidence for the existence of the Davidic dynasty in exactly the period the Jewish narrative describes. In the mesh stele from roughly the same period provides additional context for the political environment of the two kingdoms. None of these external sources corroborate the specific events of Joash's rescue and coronation. That is not surprising. Ancient Near Eastern records, including the Assyrian annals, are not comprehensive chronicles of every political event in every neighboring state. They record what their authors considered worth recording, which was primarily military victory, tribute receipt, and the demonstration of royal power. What the archaeological record does provide is a richly textured background for the kind of world in which this story takes place. The physical layout of Jerusalem in the 9th century, the Temple Mount, the palace complex to the south, the city walls, the gates has been partially recoverable through decades of careful excavation. The material culture of priestly service, the altars, the cultic vessels, the storage facilities, is increasingly well understood through finds from the period. The temple itself, as Solomon built it, has never been found. The continuous occupation of the site makes excavation impossible. But its dimensions and general design, as described in 1 Kings 6, are consistent with what we know of comparable structures from the ancient Near East. And analogous temples from the period have been identified at other sites. The world of Joash is real. The politics are real. The physical spaces in which the story unfolds are real. The specific events may be available to us only through the biblical text. But they are set against a background that archaeology continues to illuminate with increasing detail. Of all the characters in this narrative, Jehosheba may be the one whose inner life deserves the most extended contemplation. She was a princess, the daughter of a king, the sister of a king, the wife of the high priest. She had status, position, and visibility. She also had, on the night of the massacre, a choice that most people in similar situations have made in the direction of self-preservation. Do nothing, see nothing, survive. She did not make that choice. What moved her? The text does not tell us. It does not give us access to her internal deliberation in the moments before she grabbed the infant. It simply records that she acted. She saw what was happening. She understood what it meant, and she did the thing that no one else apparently thought to do or was willing to do. The Second Chronicles version of the story adds one detail that the King's version omits. It tells us that Jehosheba was the wife of Jehoiada. This is significant for several reasons. It establishes a direct connection between the royal family and the priesthood. Jehosheba was the bridge between the two institutions that collaborated in Joash's rescue and eventual coronation. It also raises the possibility that the decision to bring Joash to the temple was not made in complete isolation, that Jehosheba may have had some prior understanding with her husband, some awareness that the temple represented a safe harbor if the worst ever happened. Whether that is the case, we cannot know. What we can say is that Jehosheba made a decision in a moment of extreme danger that altered the course of Judean history, and that her decision required both courage and clarity of vision that most people in similar circumstances have not demonstrated. She's not celebrated in the tradition as widely as she might be. She does not have a book of the Bible named after her. She does not appear in the lists of heroes of faith that have been compiled across the centuries. She's a secondary character in a story that is usually told as the story of Jehoiada's plan and Joash's coronation. But the story begins with her. Without the running woman and the crying infant and the decision made in the dark, there is no plan and no coronation and no restoration. There is only a failure ruling unopposed, the covenant apparently broken, and the lamp of David extinguished. Jehoshua kept the lamp lit. Jehoiada is one of the most fascinating figures in the entire biblical narrative of the monarchy period, and he is consistently underestimated by readers who focus on the dramatic coronation scene without attending to the 6 years that preceded it. The text of 2 Chronicles records at the end of the Jewish narrative that Jehoiada died, and they buried him in the city of David among the kings, because he had done good in Israel both toward God and toward his house. To be buried among the kings in the royal tombs was an honor given to almost no one outside the actual royal family. It was the chronicler's way of saying that Jehoiada had been in the most important sense a king of Israel, a leader whose faithfulness had shaped the nation's destiny. He was by any reasonable estimate extremely old when he died. The text states that he was 130 years old, a figure that some interpreters take literally and others understand as an expression of exceptional longevity in the tradition of the patriarchs. Either way, the intent is clear. This was a man whose life spanned an extraordinary arc of history, who had seen the rise and fall of multiple reigns, and who had outlasted them all. The patience that his 6 years of waiting required was not the patience of a young man. It was the patience of someone who had seen enough history to know that moments of genuine change are rare, that they cannot be forced, and that the attempt to force them prematurely destroys the possibility of real transformation. Jehoiada waited because he understood waiting. He understood that the child needed to grow. He understood that the alliances needed to be built carefully. He understood that one premature move would end everything. He also understood something else, that his own role was instrumental, not central. He was not the king. He was not the heir. He was the priest, the guardian, the preparer, the one who would step back when the time came and let the legitimate authority be seen and recognized. This is a kind of leadership that is rare in any era, and it deserves recognition. What do we make of the child himself? He was innocent of everything that was done in his name during those 6 years. He did not choose to be born a prince. He did not choose to be hidden. He did not choose to be the focal point of a conspiracy that risked the lives of dozens of people who knew his secret. He simply was alive when everyone believed him dead, growing when the world outside thought the line had ended. His coronation was not an achievement, it was a revelation. The crown was placed on his head, not because he had earned it, but because it had always been his, because he was who he was, and who he was had been waiting 6 years for the moment when it could be publicly known. There is something in this that resonates with every story of an identity claimed after years of concealment. The person who steps out of hiding and says in effect, "I was here all along. You thought I was gone. I was not gone." Joash's later history is mixed. as is the history of almost every human being who is handed an extraordinary inheritance before they are old enough to fully understand its weight. He did good things. He also made mistakes. He carried the crown with varying degrees of grace. But in the moment of his coronation in the temple courts with the trumpet sounding and the people shouting, "Long live the King," he was simply the fulfillment of something that had been promised long before his birth, something that had been threatened by forces larger than any one person, and something that had survived barely, quietly, stubbornly, impossibly, because two people had decided it was worth protecting. The sun is beginning to set over Jerusalem. The city is different than it was this morning, quieter in the way that things are quiet after great change. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of settling, of a world that has rearranged itself around a new center of gravity and is still adjusting to the adjustment. Somewhere in the palace, a 7-year-old boy is being dressed for sleep by servants who, this time yesterday, had believed he did not exist. He has worn a crown for the first time today. He has heard his own name spoken in public for the first time. He has seen the faces of the people who are now officially, irrevocably, and forever his, until he dies or fails them, whichever comes first. He does not yet know the weight of what he carries. He is 7 years old. He knows the temple and the priests and the smell of incense and the sound of the morning and evening prayers. He knows Jehoiada's voice and Jehosheba's hands. He knows what it is to live in a small room and be told over and over that the world is larger than what he can see. Today he saw it, the world outside the temple walls, the city on the hill, the faces of the crowd, the trumpets and the shouting, and the terrible sight of a woman tearing her robes and screaming a word that he is still perhaps trying to understand. Tomorrow he will begin the long work of being king. It will take years, all the years of his life, with varying degrees of success. There will be days when he remembers what Jehoiada taught him and acts accordingly. There will be days when he forgets. But tonight he is simply a child who survived something that should have killed him. A child who was hidden and found and crowned and is now finally allowed to simply be. For 6 years, the future of a kingdom slept quietly behind temple walls, while darkness ruled publicly, while the altars of Baal burned and the sacred vessels of the temple were redirected toward foreign gods. And the people of Judah went about their lives believing that the house of David had ended on the night Athaliah's soldiers moved through the palace. While all of that was happening in a room somewhere inside the temple complex, a child was breathing, just living, just growing one day at a time into the person he was always going to be. Restoration is often not loud. It does not always announce itself. It does not always arrive with trumpets. Or if it does, those trumpets are preceded by years of silence, years of maintenance, years of doing the small and unglamorous work of keeping something alive when the world has given it up for dead. The people who do that work, the Jehoshebas and Jehoiadas of every era, rarely receive the recognition that the kings and the prophets receive. They work in the background, and they keep the secret. They rotate the guards and maintain the schedule and make sure the lamp stays lit. They wait. They wait because they know something the world does not know yet. They know that what looks finished is not finished, that what looks extinguished is not extinguished, that the promise that was spoken over a shepherd boy in Bethlehem is not the kind of promise that can be canceled by a night of violence or 6 years of usurpation. It can be hidden. It can be protected in secret. It can be preserved by human hands doing ordinary things with extraordinary faithfulness. And then when the moment arrives, when the alliances are in place and the weapons are distributed and the guards are positioned and everything is ready, It can step out into the sunlight and be seen. Long live the king. Let the night carry you now. Let the image of that temple settle in your mind. The stone walls cool in the night air. The lamps burning as they have burned every night for 40 years. The smell of cedar and incense that has soaked into the very walls of the place. Somewhere in those walls for 6 years, a child slept. The last of his line, the fulfillment of a promise that most people had stopped believing, was still in force. He was there all along. And what was true of him may be true of things you were waiting for. Things you have been told are gone, ended, finished. Things you have almost stopped hoping for yourself. Sometimes the promise is not loud. Sometimes it is not visible. Sometimes it is breathing quietly in a room you didn't know was there, waiting for the appointed moment, growing slowly in the dark, tended by faithful hands waiting for the trumpets. Let your eyes close. Let your breathing slow. Let Jerusalem fade into the soft darkness behind your eyelids. Let the sound of those trumpets, ancient, real, irresistible, follow you gently down into sleep. Long live the King. Long live the promise. Good night.